Let's talk about something that almost nobody explains correctly. You've probably heard it before. Avoidants don't fall in love. Avoidants can't attach. Avoidants don't care. They're emotionally unavailable, cold, detached, incapable of depth. That's the story floating around. And if you've ever loved someone with avoidant patterns, you might have believed it too. Because from the outside, it can look like indifference. It can look like distance. It can look like they just weren't that into you. But here's the truth that most people miss. Avoidants don't struggle with love. They struggle with safety. They don't lack feelings. They lack trust in what feelings will cost them. And that changes everything. If you've ever wondered whether an avoidant can actually fall in love, the answer might surprise you. Because when they do fall, they don't fall fast. They don't fall loud. They don't fall in a way that looks cinematic. They fall slowly, quietly, carefully, and sometimes so deeply that it terrifies them. So if you're here, trying to understand someone who pulled away, or maybe you're recognizing yourself in this pattern, stay with me, because the way avoidants fall in love is not what you think. First, we need to clear something up. Being avoidant does not mean being heartless. It does not mean being incapable of attachment. It does not mean someone wakes up and decides they don't need love. Avoidance is not the absence of emotion. It's the suppression of it. It's a learned protection strategy. Somewhere along the way, usually long before adult relationships even began, closeness felt overwhelming, unpredictable, or unsafe. Emotional needs might have been dismissed. Vulnerability might have been met with discomfort. Independence might have been praised while emotional expression was subtly discouraged. So the system adapts. The nervous system learns. Rely on yourself. Don't need too much. Don't feel too much. Don't depend too much. And that adaptation becomes an attachment style. But here's the part most people overlook. Avoidants still crave connection. They still want partnership. They still feel attraction, longing, curiosity, and love. The difference is that, when those feelings start to grow, their body doesn't interpret it as pure excitement. It interprets it as risk. Emotional closeness activates their alarm system, not because they don't care, but because caring feels like losing control. So instead of running toward love, the way anxious partners might, avoidants move cautiously. They scan, they assess, they protect, and from the outside, that protection can look like emotional distance. Now, here's where it gets even more misunderstood. Avoidants don't usually fall in love quickly. In fact, fast intensity often pushes them away. The early fireworks that feel intoxicating to others can feel destabilizing to them. When someone comes on strong, wants constant reassurance, demands rapid vulnerability, or escalates commitment quickly, an avoidance system starts flashing warning signs. It's not that they don't feel chemistry. They might feel it intensely, but intensity without safety feels like pressure, and pressure feels like loss of autonomy. So they slow down, they create space, sometimes they retreat entirely, and that retreat is often misread as lack of interest. But in many cases, it's the opposite. The more they feel, the more careful they become. Because for them, love isn't about the rush. It's about whether this connection threatens their independence, whether this person will engulf them, whether emotional demands will outweigh emotional stability. So while others might fall hard in weeks, avoidants observe for months. They don't dive. They study the water. This is where the slow burn begins. Attraction for an avoidant is rarely loud. It doesn't start with grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It starts with quiet noticing. They pay attention to how someone handles conflict. They notice whether space is respected. They observe whether emotional reactions are explosive or calm. They look for predictability, for steadiness, for someone who doesn't try to force intimacy before trust exists. The slow burn is subtle. They might not text constantly. They might not overshare early on, but internally, something is happening. They're evaluating whether it's safe to lower their guard 1 inch, and that inch matters, because for someone wired to protect their independence, even a small step toward closeness is significant. And here's something most people never see. Avoidants often replay interactions in their minds. They think about conversations. They analyze tone. They consider whether they felt pressured or respected. This is not indifference. This is risk assessment. Love for them is not impulsive. It is calculated. And that calculation doesn't mean it's shallow. It means it's careful. Then comes a moment that changes everything. It's not dramatic. It's not announced. But internally, it's a shift. They realize they're paying more attention. They start looking forward to conversations. They feel calmer in this person's presence, not excited in a chaotic way, but regulated, grounded. And that's when something new happens. Instead of scanning for escape routes, they start testing proximity. Not all at once, just slightly. They might share a personal story. They might initiate plans. They might allow a longer hug. These gestures might seem small to someone else, but for an avoidant, they are enormous, because what's happening underneath is trust beginning to form, and trust is the gateway to love for them. Not chemistry, not passion, trust, the kind of trust built through consistency, through emotional steadiness, through knowing that closeness won't immediately turn into control. And here's the part that really flips the narrative. Avoidants often fall in love when they feel safe being themselves without being consumed. When someone doesn't demand constant emotional proof. When space is given without punishment. When independence is respected rather than interpreted as rejection. Safety for them isn't about constant reassurance. It's about emotional stability. It's about knowing that if they step back for a moment, the relationship won't collapse. And when they experience that kind of calm consistency, something softens. The walls don't disappear overnight, but they lower gradually. And as they lower, feelings grow, slowly, steadily, in a way that doesn't feel explosive, but feels enduring. That's how avoidants actually fall in love. Not through intensity, through stability. Not through pressure, through patience. Not through emotional overwhelm, through emotional safety. If you've loved someone like this, you might have mistaken their slowness for lack of depth. You might have wondered why they didn't express feelings as quickly as you did. But what if their pace wasn't about caring less? What if it was about protecting more? What if every small step they took toward you required them to override years of self-protection? When an avoidant begins to fall, it's often invisible at first, but internally, it's significant. They're negotiating with their fear. They're testing vulnerability. They're choosing connection over isolation, one cautious step at a time. And that choice matters, because for someone wired to survive through independence, choosing closeness is not casual, it's brave. So if you've ever believed that avoidants don't fall in love, let this sink in. They do. They just fall differently. They don't sprint into attachment. They inch into it. They don't declare it dramatically. They discover it gradually. And by the time they realize they're in love, it's often been building quietly for a long time. The truth is, avoidants aren't incapable of love. They're cautious with it. And sometimes, the love that grows slowly is the kind that lasts. And sometimes, the love that grows slowly is the kind that lasts. But here's where things get complicated. Because just when you think everything is steady, just when the connection starts to feel deeper, that's often when the pullback happens. And if you've been on the receiving end of that, it can feel like emotional whiplash. One moment they're leaning in, the next moment they're distant, quiet, harder to reach, and you're left wondering what changed. What changed is this: their feelings grew, and when feelings grow, so does fear. For an avoidant, emotional intensity doesn't just mean closeness. It means vulnerability. It means dependence. It means the possibility of loss. And if somewhere in their history, closeness felt overwhelming or unreliable, their nervous system doesn't interpret deepening love as purely positive. It interprets it as risk. So when attachment strengthens, their protective system activates. They might suddenly focus on flaws. They might crave more space. They might become hyper-aware of their independence, not because they stopped caring, but because caring started to matter. This is the paradox most people never understand. Avoidants don't pull away because they feel nothing. They pull away because they feel too much. When they begin to genuinely care, it threatens the identity they've built around self-sufficiency. It challenges the belief that they don't need anyone, and that challenge can feel destabilizing. So they deactivate, they suppress, they distract themselves with work, hobbies, logic. They convince themselves the relationship isn't that serious. They zoom in on minor incompatibilities. They create emotional distance to regulate the intensity inside them. From the outside, it looks like coldness. Internally, it's self-protection. And here's something deeply important. When avoidants pull away during this phase, they are often fighting an internal battle you cannot see. Part of them wants closeness. Part of them fears it. Part of them feels safe with you. Part of them is scanning for escape. They can love someone and still crave distance at the same time. That contradiction is real for them. It's not manipulation, it's nervous system conflict. Inside, their experience of love can feel overwhelming in a way they struggle to articulate. They might think about you constantly, but hesitate to text. They might miss you deeply, but convince themselves they need space. They might imagine a future, but panic at the idea of losing control. Their emotions are often intense, but expression feels unsafe, so they default to logic, to practicality, to restraint. They rarely narrate their feelings dramatically. They rarely gush, but that doesn't mean the feelings aren't there. In fact, avoidants often experience love as a quiet undercurrent rather than a loud wave. It's steady, it's internal, it's not performative. And because they've learned to contain emotions, they might not even fully realize how deep they've fallen until something threatens the bond. Trust is the turning point, and for avoidance, trust is not built through words. It's built through repetition, through consistency, through watching how someone responds over time. They don't attach because someone says, "I care about you." They attach because someone shows up, predictably, because someone respects space without withdrawing love, because conflict doesn't turn into chaos. They are studying whether closeness equals safety. Every time you react calmly instead of dramatically, their nervous system records it. Every time you respect a boundary without guilt tripping, their defenses lower slightly. Every time you allow space without punishment, something inside them softens. Trust for them isn't emotional intensity. It's emotional steadiness. And when that steadiness becomes consistent, they begin to relax. But even then, they may test it. And this is another part that gets misinterpreted. Avoidants test emotional safety. Subtly, they might delay responding to see if you overreact. They might express a small need and observe whether it's dismissed. They might take space and watch whether you spiral. These aren't conscious games. They're unconscious experiments. They are asking without words, if I step back, will you stay grounded? If I show a crack, will you exploit it? If I don't perform affection constantly, will you punish me? When their tests are met with calm consistency, something powerful happens. Their internal narrative begins to shift. Maybe closeness isn't engulfing. Maybe dependence doesn't mean losing themselves. Maybe love can exist without chaos. And that's when their attachment deepens in a way that feels less frightening. Now let's talk about the difference between infatuation and real love for them. Infatuation can actually feel uncomfortable to an avoidant. The butterflies, the obsession, the urgency, that level of emotional intensity can trigger their avoidance. It feels destabilizing. It feels like losing control, so they might downplay it, they might rationalize it away, they might create distance to regain equilibrium. Real love, though? Real love feels different. It feels calm, predictable, safe. It's not about constant adrenaline. It's about steady presence. And this is where many misunderstandings happen, because society glorifies passion as proof of love, drama, jealousy, urgency. But avoidants don't equate chaos with connection. In fact, chaos often pushes them further away. When they fall in love in a healthy way, it doesn't look explosive, it looks grounded. They start integrating you into their routines. They consider your needs quietly. They plan long-term in subtle ways. They don't always announce it, but they begin to factor you into their decisions. That's love for them. Practical, stable, integrated. And independence remains central. This is crucial. Even in love, avoidants value autonomy deeply. Space is not a threat to their attachment, it strengthens it. When they have room to breathe, they feel safer coming closer. When they don't feel trapped, they choose connection more willingly. But when independence is misunderstood as rejection, conflict begins. If a partner reacts to their need for space with anxiety or accusations, it reinforces their fear that closeness equals pressure, and pressure reactivates avoidance. So here's the emotional truth. Avoidants are not running from love. They are running from losing themselves. They fear merging so completely that their identity dissolves. They fear emotional demands they cannot meet. They fear being needed in a way that feels suffocating, and until they feel confident that they can love without disappearing, part of them will hesitate. But when they finally reach the point where safety outweighs fear, when trust has been built slowly, when space has been respected, when emotional reactions have remained steady, something shifts permanently. The tipping point isn't dramatic, it's internal. They realize they don't feel the urge to escape anymore. They realize closeness doesn't feel like a trap. They realize they want to stay. And when an avoidant chooses to stay, it's not impulsive, it's intentional. By the time they commit, they have thought it through more than you know. They have analyzed compatibility, they have weighed independence against intimacy, they have monitored their own fear responses, and if they're still there, still choosing you, it's because the connection feels safe enough to invest in. That kind of commitment is quiet but powerful. It's not based on adrenaline, it's based on stability. It's not about being swept away, it's about consciously deciding that vulnerability is worth the risk. If you've ever doubted whether an avoidance love was real because it didn't look dramatic, hear this clearly. Love doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers, sometimes it shows up in consistency instead of intensity. Sometimes it expresses itself through reliability instead of romance. Avoidance may not fall loudly, but when they fall securely, they fall with intention. And intention is deeper than impulse. Now, let's talk about something that most people completely overlook, how avoidants actually show love. Because if you're waiting for dramatic declarations, constant verbal reassurance, or grand emotional performances, you might miss it entirely. Their love language is often subtle, practical, quietly consistent. An avoidant in love may not flood you with poetic words, but they will fix the problem you mentioned in passing. They will remember the small detail you forgot you shared. They will show up when it truly matters. They may not text all day, but when you need them, they are there in a grounded way. Their affection often looks like action, more than expression. It looks like loyalty. It looks like problem solving. It looks like steady presence instead of emotional intensity. And here's why. Expressing love verbally requires vulnerability. It requires exposing feelings that feel overwhelming inside them. So instead of saying everything they feel, they demonstrate it in ways that feel safer. They'll build something stable with you. They'll integrate you into their life gradually. They'll protect the relationship through consistency rather than constant emotional reassurance. But because their love is understated, partners sometimes assume it's shallow. They compare it to louder, more expressive attachment styles. They wonder why the avoidant doesn't gush, why they don't constantly validate, why they don't seem overwhelmed by emotion. And the avoidant, sensing that their way of loving isn't being recognized, may retreat further, not because they don't care, but because they feel misunderstood. If you've ever been loved by someone like this, think back. Did they support you in practical ways? Did they create stability? Did they respect your independence while quietly protecting the bond? That was love. It just didn't look like fireworks. It looked like foundation. Now, beneath all of this sits one of the deepest fears avoidants carry, the fear of losing themselves. This isn't about not wanting connection, it's about identity preservation. Somewhere along their development, autonomy became synonymous with safety. Being self-reliant meant being protected. So when love begins to deepen, there's an unconscious fear that closeness will erase that autonomy. They may worry that they'll become responsible for someone else's emotions in a way that feels overwhelming. They may fear that their space will shrink, that expectations will grow, that emotional demands will exceed their capacity. And even if those fears are not consciously spoken, they shape behavior. This is why merging constant togetherness, constant emotional processing, constant intensity can feel threatening to them. It's not that they don't want closeness. They just need reassurance that closeness won't swallow them whole. And here's something that's rarely said out loud. Many avoidants didn't learn how to balance intimacy and individuality in childhood. They learned one extreme or the other. So as adults, they are trying to navigate something they were never modeled. They're figuring out how to stay connected without disappearing. And that process can look clumsy. It can look distant. It can look inconsistent. But underneath it, there is often genuine desire to love without losing themselves. So when do they actually realize they're in love? It's rarely a lightning bolt moment. It's not usually a dramatic confession in the rain. It's quieter than that. They might notice they miss you in your absence. Not in a panicked way, but in a steady ache. They might realize that their future plans automatically include you. They might catch themselves wanting to share something meaningful instead of handling it alone. And that realization can surprise them, because avoidants often intellectualize emotions before fully feeling them. They may analyze it first. This makes sense. This person is stable. This feels healthy. The logic comes before the emotional surrender, and once the logic confirms safety, the emotional acceptance follows, slowly, carefully. And when they finally admit to themselves that they're in love, it often carries weight, because it means they've crossed an internal barrier. They've allowed someone past the protective walls. They've chosen vulnerability over isolation. That choice is not casual for them, it's significant. But what happens if they get hurt? This is where the shutdown can be profound. When an avoidant experiences betrayal, rejection, or emotional overwhelm, their default response is to retreat inward. They compartmentalize, they suppress, they convince themselves they don't need the connection. They may appear fine on the surface, composed, rational, moving forward quickly, but internally, the impact can be delayed. Avoidants often process grief later, weeks, sometimes months after the breakup, when distractions fade and silence settles in, the feelings surface. And because they're not used to sitting with intense vulnerability, it can hit hard. They may replay conversations, they may feel regret, they may recognize the depth of their attachment only after it's gone. But instead of reaching out impulsively, they may stay silent. Pride, fear, self-protection, all of it combines to keep them from exposing that pain. And so people assume they never cared, when in reality, they care deeply, they just process differently. Now here's the hopeful part. Avoidants are not stuck. Attachment patterns are not life sentences. When self-awareness enters the picture, everything can change. An avoidant who begins to understand their triggers can start pausing instead of pulling away. They can learn to communicate their need for space instead of disappearing. They can recognize when fear, not incompatibility, is driving their distance. And with effort, reflection, and sometimes guidance, they can move towards secure attachment. Secure love for an avoidant doesn't mean losing independence. It means integrating it. It means realizing that autonomy and intimacy can coexist, that needing someone doesn't erase strength, that vulnerability doesn't equal weakness. And when an avoidant becomes more secure, their love becomes powerful in a different way. It becomes steady and expressive. It becomes independent, yet connected. It becomes calm, but emotionally available. They don't lose themselves, they expand. If you're someone who loves an avoidant, or you see yourself in these patterns, here's something important to hold on to. Love with an avoidant requires balance. You cannot chase them into closeness. Pressure amplifies fear, but you also cannot abandon your own needs. Healthy connection is not about shrinking yourself to accommodate someone else's defenses. It's about mutual growth. If you're loving an avoidant, consistency matters more than intensity. Calm communication matters more than dramatic reassurance. Giving space without punishment matters more than constant proximity. But at the same time, your boundaries matter too. Secure love is not built on one person doing all the adjusting. And if you are the avoidant listening to this, understand this gently. Your need for space is valid. Your independence is valuable. But isolation is not the same as strength. You are allowed to want love. You are allowed to need connection. You are allowed to feel deeply without it, making you weak. Avoidants don't fear love itself. They fear the loss of control that sometimes accompanies it. They fear being engulfed. They fear being dependent. They fear being exposed in ways they can't manage. But when they learn that control doesn't have to disappear for love to exist, something shifts permanently. And that's the truth. Most people never hear. Avoidants are not emotionally empty. They are emotionally cautious. They are not incapable of commitment. They are intentional about it. They are not heartless. They are protective. When they fall in love, it may not look like fireworks. It may not be loud, but it is deep. It is deliberate. And when it is rooted in safety, it can be one of the most stable forms of love there is. So, if you've ever questioned whether avoidants actually fall in love, now you know. They do. Slowly, carefully, quietly. But when they choose you, not out of pressure, not out of fear, not out of intensity, but out of genuine safety and intention, that choice carries weight. And that kind of love, built on steadiness rather than chaos, has the potential to last. And that kind of love, built on steadiness rather than chaos, has the potential to last. But let's bring this full circle, because there's one final truth that ties everything together, the truth that completely reframes the way you see avoidance in love. Avoidants don't fear love. They fear losing control inside love. They fear what happens when emotions get bigger than their ability to manage them. They fear needing someone in a way that makes them feel exposed. They fear that if they lean too far in, they won't know how to stand on their own again. And that fear can quietly shape every stage of their romantic journey. Think about it. From the beginning, they move slowly, not because they don't feel attraction, but because they are protecting stability. When feelings grow, they pull back. Not because they don't care, but because they care enough to feel vulnerable. When they test you, they're not playing games, they're scanning for safety. When they ask for space, they're not rejecting you, they're regulating themselves. Everything comes back to control, emotional control, environmental control, internal control. And when control feels threatened, avoidance activates. But here's the powerful shift. The moment an avoidant realizes that love does not require surrendering their entire identity, that they can stay themselves and still stay connected, that's when transformation begins. Because real love isn't about losing yourself, it's about expanding yourself. And when an avoidant understands that, their fear softens. They begin to see that vulnerability is not the same as helplessness, that leaning on someone doesn't mean collapsing, that partnership doesn't mean prison, and that realization changes everything. Let's talk about what secure love actually looks like for someone who once leaned avoidant. It looks like communicating instead of disappearing. It looks like saying, I need space to think instead of withdrawing in silence. It looks like allowing someone to see uncertainty instead of masking it with indifference. It looks like staying present during discomfort instead of shutting down at the first sign of intensity. Growth doesn't happen overnight. Avoidants don't wake up suddenly, craving constant emotional processing, but they can learn to tolerate closeness without panic. They can learn to sit with vulnerability without running. They can learn that conflict does not equal catastrophe. And here's something deeply hopeful. Avoidants who become self-aware often make incredibly steady partners, because once they choose love consciously, once they've done the internal work to understand their fears, they love with loyalty, with intention, with depth that isn't impulsive, but anchored. They don't commit lightly, so when they do, it's deliberate. Now, if you're someone who has loved an avoidant and felt confused, hurt, or rejected, this part is for you. Your pain is real. Mixed signals hurt, emotional distance hurts, silence hurts, and understanding their psychology doesn't erase the impact on you. It just gives context. It explains why someone can care deeply and still pull away. It explains why someone can miss you and not reach out. It explains why love might have been present, even when expression was limited. But here's the boundary you must hold. Understanding avoidance is not the same as tolerating emotional neglect. Love requires mutual effort. If someone refuses to grow, refuses to communicate, refuses to meet you halfway, that's not attachment style. That's avoidance without accountability. Secure love is not about chasing someone into vulnerability. It's about two people moving toward each other, even if slowly. If you are avoidant and listening to this, here's something honest but gentle. You don't have to choose between independence and intimacy. That belief was survival. It doesn't have to be your future. You are allowed to build a life where space and closeness coexist. You are allowed to love deeply without losing strength. And if you've ever felt ashamed of your distance, if you've ever wondered why closeness sometimes feels suffocating, understand that your nervous system learned that response for a reason. But what was once protective can become limited. Growth means teaching your system that safety can exist inside connection. That doesn't mean forcing yourself into overwhelming emotional situations. It means practicing small stretches, staying in the conversation a little longer, sharing one vulnerable thought instead of none, allowing someone to reassure you instead of pretending you don't need it. Love is not meant to feel like drowning, and it's not meant to feel like isolation either. It's meant to feel like steady expansion. So what does it truly mean? When an avoidant falls in love, it means they've decided the risk is worth it. It means they've evaluated their fear and chosen connection anyway. It means they've allowed someone to see parts of them they usually keep guarded. It may not come with fireworks. It may not come with dramatic speeches, but it comes with consistency, with loyalty, with intention, and sometimes that quiet steadiness is far more powerful than intensity that burns fast and fades. There's something almost old school about the way avoidants love when they're healthy. It's not about constant validation. It's about building something solid. It's about showing up. It's about staying. It's about choosing each other again and again without needing chaos to feel alive. And in a world that glorifies drama as passion, that kind of grounded love can feel unfamiliar. But unfamiliar doesn't mean empty. It means mature. The real question isn't whether avoidants can fall in love. It's whether they feel safe enough to stay when they do. Because falling is only the beginning. Staying requires trust. Staying requires vulnerability. Staying requires believing that love won't erase you. And when they reach that point, when they no longer feel the urge to escape, every time emotions deepen, that's when you see the most beautiful shift. The walls don't just lower temporarily, they stay down. The distance doesn't just pause, it dissolves gradually. The fear doesn't vanish completely, but it no longer controls their behavior. That's secure love. Not the absence of fear, but the ability to choose connection despite it. So, if you've ever questioned your own worth because someone avoidant pulled away, hear this clearly. Their distance was about regulation, not your value. Their silence was about fear, not your desirability. Their slowness was about safety, not lack of depth. And if you're the avoidant who has pushed someone away out of fear, it's not too late to reflect. It's not too late to grow. It's not too late to build differently next time. Love doesn't demand perfection. It demands willingness. Avoidants don't love less. They love carefully. And when care meets courage, when caution meets self-awareness, the result isn't coldness, it's stability. So the next time someone says avoidants can't fall in love, you'll know the truth. They can. They do. Just not in the loud, chaotic way people expect. They fall quietly. They fall intentionally. They fall when they feel safe enough to risk being seen. And when they choose to stay, when they decide that connection is not a threat but a home, that love may not shake the ground beneath you, but it will build something strong enough to stand on.